Hi, welcome back to the Forum Historia. This is our fifth episode. I don't know, we'll figure it out later. But today we're going to be talking about the First Crusade.
It's a very exciting topic.
It is a very exciting topic. And we're going to kind of be going through, Phil here is going to give a sort of brief overview of the sort of events of the First Crusade and that kind of stuff. And then we're going to kind of dive a bit deeper into sort of like the reception of the First Crusade during the time in Europe, as well as sort of how Europeans looked at it, 200 years after the fact. And we're also going to go a bit into the sort of social aspect of the main actors of this whole sort of thing. So
it's really fun with the First Crusade, how it kind of gets started. It goes all the way back into the 1060s. There's a lot of Turkish invasions into Anatolia. If you look on the map, you can see the start of the Turks moving in, and there's this big battle in the 1060s called Manzikert, and they kill the Byzantine emperor at the time in battle. And basically, because of this, the empire's pushed all the way back to the Aegean and the Bosphorus, with only really a few cities and strongholds on the east coast holding out. And so this is a really bad time. And that's on the east, but in the west, you also have the Normans invading southern Italy and Sicily and pushing the Byzantines out of that. And so they kind of retreat to this imperial heartland in the Balkans around Greece and Constantinople. And it's a pretty bad time, combined with the fact that there's another coup and another civil war, as always
civil war, yeah.
As always, at the most opportune times. But we get my favourite emperor, one of my little personal favourites, Alexius Komnenus I. And we hear a lot about him in his daughter's biography, the Alexiad, which she writes after his death. And what's interesting about it is that it's the first ever written main work in Greek by a woman. And so what really gets the ball rolling with the Crusades is Alexius petitions to the Pope, and he says, hey, we're in a bit of trouble at the moment. We've got a whole bunch of Turks, got a whole bunch of Normans. We don't know what to do. We're stuck. Could you send over some of your knights and your men-at-arms and just help us out, just for a little bit? And the Pope there's a few church councils going on at the time, but the most famous is the Council of Clermont in July 1095. And this is this famous speech by Pope Urban II, where he offers absolution and spiritual freedom from purgatory for all those who go to the Holy Land. And there's this whole wave of religious fanaticism that kind of sweeps up at the time. And so it's not just the religious aspects that kind of get pushed. There's also a lot of other factors that are kind of coming into play with making the Crusades happen when they do. The other thing is that a lot of second and third sons of German and Norman nobility are going abroad. So the reason that we have the invasion of Sicily is second sons of Norman aristocrats don't have land, so they go off and they conquer their own places. So this happens where you get all these aristocrats, landed knights, fighting off. And so that, combined with the religious fervour, combined with poor people, peasants, wanting to make some money through looting and booty, combined all into this huge uplift where everyone now wants to go crusading because the Pope says that they can. Which is actually the complete opposite of what the Emperor Alexius wanted to happen. He can't afford to hold thousands and thousands of peasants and knights in his land. He's got no land there. He's under siege. And so it's an immense stress. So you were saying that there's a lot of poor relationships with them, isn't there, Matthew?
The sort of relations between Byzantium and the West, they've always been quite fractured.
At best.
At best, yeah. But in particular, with the Crusades, as Phil was saying, here's a huge crusading army that's now, arriving and traveling through Byzantium. And at this time, armies don't really use supplies necessarily. They always forage for food and supplies in the areas that they are. And, it's hard to imagine how devastating, an army of 30,000 odd people is when they're foraging for food, and, when they're going through villages and stuff like that, taking what food they can. And also just trampling fields, where you've planted a lot of grain and your harvest is supposed to be happening, but now it's been destroyed by just people marching through and things like that. It's honestly, it's a very devastating thing to actually be happening, more so than sort of the effects on the common people that battles have. The actual armies marching through those common places is usually what's the most devastating. And so we get to see from a few different sources how the Byzantines react to this, and they start to treat the Westerners quite poorly, with a lot of hostility for these reasons. And it's interesting because what we can see here is not just necessarily the tensions between sort of Orthodox Christianity and Catholicism, but we can also see how a large portion of Europe in general views these crusades. Obviously we have a lot of support for the crusades. A lot of people from a lot of different places are partaking in these crusades and sending money and men and things like that. But on the other hand, we can also see people who deliberately fought against the Crusaders. For example, in the Chronica Gestis Hungarorum, the Chronicle of the Hungarians, we can see stories of when the Crusaders were marching through Hungary. In a lot of cases, they actually fought against the Crusaders, and in some cases, they actually wiped out entire retinues of Crusaders, simply because that's what they were doing. They were coming through, destroying lands and things like that. And in some cases, they even besieged castles for that reason, to find resources to continue their journey and things like that.
Yeah, they set fire to Belgrade and were almost going to do the same to Niš before Alexius sent a whole army to escort them all the way through.
Yeah, exactly. And so, we can see that these Crusaders, they're very hostile, not just to to those that they're supposedly crusading against, but to everybody in general. And it's not hard to see why. Europe at this time is a very warlike society, and they regularly fight each other more than they do those they're supposedly crusading against. So it's quite a hostile time. And again, the point is that we can see that the Crusades are not unanimously seen as the best thing. Often the countries where the Crusaders went through, they usually at the time looked at it as being quite a negative thing to be coming through their country.
And it's been touched on already so far, but the Byzantines, basically when they requested aid, they were expecting a small but professional force of soldiers to help them retake some of their land in Anatolia, and, well, if they could, press further on. They weren't expecting large groups of, though there were, of course, knights and trained soldiers, most people were either on the lookout for just a change of lifestyle, almost as generic as that sounds. So having, 30,000 people who aren't very disciplined kind of march through with a lot of bravado, and of course the conflicts that happened, obviously different crusading groups had different kind of, let's say, adventures throughout Europe.
Yeah.
Obviously, you'd have, the Jewish massacres in lots of
in the Rhineland,
in the Rhineland and stuff, and also you have Christians kind of being trying to defend their local Jewish communities, but to no avail.
Yeah.
So obviously, anti-Semitism was a big part of medieval society, but it kind of shows, it comes to a head and it shows how ill-disciplined most of these forces were.
Yeah.
They may have been led by knights, and but most people were just, I think the word rabble kind of comes to mind.
Yeah. By the way, this is a sort of guest star
Our
speaker.
guest star, our best friend Noah.
Yeah.
Hello.
Who's kindly come on. Again, going back to Hungary, for example, right? Some knights and their retinue, I think Godfrey, for example, although I'll have to check that one, passed through peacefully with no issues whatsoever. And so you can see that a difference in discipline between the Crusaders, a large difference there. Some are quite undisciplined, whereas others are very disciplined and travel through peacefully without causing too much havoc on the landscape and the countries they pass through.
It also goes to show where there was one of the first Crusades was the People's Crusades, which was solely made up of rabble and peasants that probably did most of the damage until the Fourth Crusade.
Very true,
in terms of looting and stealing and pillaging, because you just have a bunch of French and German peasants who are basically serfs. And this is the first time they've even left their village, let alone going all the way to Constantinople. And it's an absolute slaughter. Once they barely leave Europe, and a bunch of Turkish archers just slaughter them in a matter of days. And it's probably one of the worst defeats of the Crusades at all, before you actually get to the Fourth Crusade, 200 years later. But the First Crusade, the first proper crusade really, kind of starts in the summer of about 1097, where you have these, was it Geoffrey of Bouillon and
Godfrey of Bouillon,
Godfrey, Beaumont, all the famous names that you see later on.
And most of them are French as well.
It should be Norman, Provençal, Frank, whatever. And they're all made to swear an oath to the Emperor Alexius, because their mission is to take back all the cities that were captured by the Seljuks. And this goes off to a great start, where you have the sieges of Nicaea and Dorylaeum during that time, where they take the cities and they move inland. And these cities are taken without much fuss. They're just a quick siege, and they start moving overland. But it starts becoming, because their supplies are thin, and like before, that they have to forage off the land. The summer of 1097 and 1098 is just horrendously hot. And so these people are struggling, and they kind of believe now that the emperor has abandoned them. And so they start going off on their own. And it's when we get to Antioch in about 1098 that you have Baldwin of Bouillon, who's adopted by the Count of Edessa and proclaims himself the prince, and this becomes the first independent Crusader state outside of the influence of the emperor in Constantinople. And then you go to the siege of Antioch itself, where it's 8 months long, and there's no Byzantine support at all. There's no help, and there's attrition that leads to hundreds and thousands dying over this spring and summer. And because they're not supported by the Byzantine navy in any regard now, there's not a proper blockade, and so the city is partially still supplied during the entirety of this siege. So there's also strong arguments by historians that there was a whole lot of interracial tension between the different crusading armies. So you have Normans, Franks, Provençals, Germans, English, all together, and they all have their own separate goals, separate desires for leadership, the noblemen wanting glory, and then the peasants having their kind of don't know who these people are, that back in Europe they would have fought against each other, and here they are now in coalition helping each other. It's a pretty kind of monumental twist on the traditional warfare in Europe. And so because of such a hard siege, it essentially, there is a lot of fighting just amongst the Crusaders. But, can you guess what happened, Matt? They won. And so eventually Antioch does fall, but it's an absolute slaughter. Like one of those horrendous massacres that we hear about with the Crusades. And it's kind of the reason why the Crusades have such a negative view, historiographically speaking now, like in terms of in Muslim scholarship, that they see the Crusade as an invading, massacring army, because of these sorts of atrocities that we see at the end of sieges, where cities are looted completely and everything is taken back to Rome and to Paris and Venice. And interestingly enough, the holy lance that is said to have pierced Jesus when he was on the crucifix is found in Antioch, and that's taken back with the Crusaders. And it's then after this that we get Beaumont, who is then made Prince of Antioch and becomes basically the first proper Crusader state of any power, because Edessa's only a small state. Antioch is a really big city for the time, and it's one of the ecumenical sees. That we have Jerusalem, Istanbul, and then we have Antioch.
So yeah, Phil was mentioning like a little bit further back the sort of social component of the Crusades, and how, you know, these are people that were at war with each other, you know, 10 years ago, and have been at war with each other for, you know, centuries, right? And now they're all coming together for this one crusade, you know, under one sort of army. And it's quite interesting, I guess, from that perspective. But kind of what I want to focus on is the fact that these are all sort of individual lords with their own individual sort of reasons for being there, and their own like objectives and things. It's kind of reflected in the fact that the Crusade doesn't actually have a leader. There's no king of the Crusaders, right? That's controlling all of these lords. You know, there's a lot of different influential lords a part of this. You know, for example, we've mentioned Godfrey of Boulogne, and Baldric as well. There's another one, you know, Guibert of Nugent, and there's quite a number of really wealthy and influential noblemen that are the leadership combined of this crusade. And it's really interesting to note that, you know, despite that, and despite the fact that they've been at war for, you know, with each other over the past, you know, decades or whatever, the past lifetime, I should say, they still succeed. You know, they still managed to take Antioch, and of course they managed to take Jerusalem. And, you know, whether or not that was the sort of original plan, you know, it has to be said that they did manage to succeed with something, you know,
Against all odds.
Against the odds, right? It's, you know, it's interesting that they managed to work together without a single leader, for example, for all of this time. But yeah, so it's just a little bit of the sort of social sort of component of it as we go along. You know, this is stuff to keep in mind as we talk about these sieges and things.
And it's probably definitely to do with the religious unity that Noah was saying earlier about that there's a promise of absolution.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I guess I have two more points to that. It's there's the obvious thing of, like, in terms of them succeeding, they achieve their goal, which is quite a broad goal. But of course, after they achieve that, there's no real reason for people to stay unless you have a stake in the new Crusader states, kind of their rise. You know, if you're looking to make a name for yourself, and of course, a lot of, you know, landless knights would see it's a great time to kind of swear fealty to these new lords. And also, back onto the against the odds thing, because a lot of people, I think, would view it as, you know, a massive European army coming in and attacking, you know, a defenseless state. And of course there were divisions between the I think the Seljuk emirs, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong. In the
I'd say Sultan. Maybe.
Sultans,
Yeah.
And of course there was a lack of unity there. But most of the things that define as against the odds is, of course, them staying together and managing not to just starve to death.
Yeah, that's probably the biggest
they did a lot of starving, a lot of infighting, and even with that, like, long marches with an enemy that fights in a way that obviously the terrain did not favour the Crusaders. So I think that's a way to look at it as, of course, there was a large European army, but it really was against the odds, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, it's interesting to mention the terrain, because I feel like, not that I have any particular evidence for this, this is just kind of sort of just reasoning at the moment, but and a small side topic, but, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if the terrain itself and the sort of location they're at is also a factor for why they were sticking together for so long. Because, you know, if you consider, if you're out in the desert and you've just made a march to somewhere, and you know that you don't have the supplies to go back, you know, and there's really no way of going back at this point. You can only go forwards. You know, that really does, in a lot of cases, I guess, bring people together and make them more complacent, rather than, create infighting. Because, if you can't leave, generally speaking, people tend to try and work together as much as possible, because otherwise that's it, you're going to die, so, yeah.
Yeah, on that, it's completely agree with that. It's like, I can't give an example, but obviously they would have learned very early on, like, if you send people out to scavenge for supplies, you're going to find them a few days later, full of arrows with pretty much, not the supplies that you wanted. So, hit and run tactics would definitely would be used on smaller groups. So I completely agree. The whole, the infighting was kind of tempered by the fact that they couldn't be complacent. They couldn't assume they were going to win this. And of course, the ones that did ended up with a very grisly fate, in my understanding.
And the Turks by nature are horsemen with horse archers coming from the steppes, which is a completely different way of fighting to the Crusaders.
So,
and even things like the heat, European troops, assuming, I guess let's use like infantry as an example, assuming they are equipped decently, they're wearing heavyish armor, which the Turks tended not to wear as much unless they were, I guess, like the elite kind of, I'm going to use the word like shock cavalry, because obviously the Turks did have, as in heavy cavalry, but obviously not in the same compositions as the Europeans.
Yeah.
Yeah, so after Antioch, there's kind of a slow march towards Jerusalem. And again, the ever-present problem is food and water, of which the Crusaders have none, and the Turks have yes. And so this is one of those against all odds things that the Crusaders managed to take Jerusalem in 1099. I mean, not even all of the army was fighting, because apparently the Provençal contingents of the crusading army just decided they had enough, and they were like, "Nah, I'm done," and they didn't fight. But there were no Provençal kings of Jerusalem. So what do you think that says about it? That the Normans and the French stood by and stood it out to the end. And so eventually Jerusalem does fall, and much like with Antioch, it's this horrendous massacre. Like, it's pretty bad, Matt, isn't it?
Well, I mean,
It's noble.
yeah, but on the other side though, I mean, a lot of sieges end in massacre. Like, this isn't like
sacking goes a long way.
Yeah, like, this isn't an isolated case. Like, this tends to happen quite a lot. I mean, even you look at the Fourth Crusade, right? The sacking of Constantinople, it's very much the same kind of thing. So it's not an isolated case.
Yeah, and adding on that, that's the general kind of rules of warfare that did kind of translate across religious bounds. Was you gave a city the opportunity to surrender, and if they didn't, they were forfeiting their lives. And that's why you see basically when this happens, the garrison will not survive. Of course, sacking does happen. Sometimes they'll be more merciful, in which the civilian population are relatively unmolested, but the garrison, unless they make a quick escape, make a last-minute deal, or are very, very lucky, are not going to survive, because they've made the conscious decision. Well, I should say the garrison commander has made the conscious decision to hold out, and this happens, throughout history.
Yeah,
especially even up to Justinian and the reconquest of Italy.
Yeah,
by Belisarius. After the I think the Goths. Goths. It's counterattacking. A lot of cities that were taken by the Romans are retaken, but then everyone is slaughtered because they basically gave in to the Romans. So it's not fair, but that's kind of how it works.
It's just, it kind of is what it is. But
and the sack of Jerusalem, pretty much, this is the end of the First Crusade, guys. We did it. So after this, then they have in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, they kind of have a council and basically state build and decide how they're going to rule, what they're going to do. And so they kind of have this, they basically sit out and create a Catholic archbishop in charge, because there's now no Orthodox archbishop, which is basically against what they were doing in the first place when they were supposed to be helping the Byzantines. They just do this incredible 180, and now they're like, nope, we're going to build our own Crusader kingdom. And they kind of have to decide between a few different people on who they want to be king. So they have They have the famous leaders, Raymond of Toulouse, Godfrey, Eustace, Baldwin, and it's eventually that they land on Godfrey to take up this kingship of Jerusalem. And we'll talk about it in future episodes, but basically Jerusalem stays as a kingdom until it falls 100 or so years later in about, was it the Third Crusade?
It was before the Third Crusade.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the Third Crusade was to
retake
it, yeah.
So this moment here is Godfrey taking up kingship, and his dynasty will rule as kings and queens of Jerusalem for another century or so.
I mean, I guess the next sort of thing I want to talk about is it's hard to overstate how fanatic these Crusaders were. I mean, obviously we can say that they were fanatic. They're going, they're choosing to go and fight and kill people well away from where they're from, places they've never been before, for God or whatever. So it's obviously from that perspective we can see that they were quite fanatic, but it goes like a lot deeper than that, than what we would initially expect. For example, regular sort of ceremonial Christian events and things like that, they still occurred, in so much that even during transit across these desert sort of wastelands where there's very little food and water, as well as even during sieges, mass, for example, was regularly undertaken. And this is, I guess, a pretty spectacular thing when you consider that in these circumstances back home, a lot of the times this wouldn't happen. A lot of the times, because they're in a siege, about to go to battle, for example, whatever, these sorts of things would not be commonplace. They would likely happen in small groups, but it wouldn't be as big as it is.
They were more rational about it.
Yeah, I guess you could put it that way. Yeah, like because what we're talking about here is an army of 30,000 people stopping for the day just to go to mass and observe these ceremonies, right? Which it normally wouldn't happen in such a way. It would be if it was to happen, it would be a much smaller contingent that would rotate through, kind of thing, until everybody got their chance. And really, we can see the reason for this is because in the medieval period, victory to those people didn't come about because they were the best fighters or something like that. It came about because God wanted them to win, kind of thing. And victory comes through God. And so they can really, I think in a way it also kind of shows, like, I guess how not scared but worried they were that this wasn't going to go well, because you consider that they're really far from home. Like I said, it's quite hard for them to get back. They needed to win, and so in that way we can see their insecurity about it, because they're doing everything right, and perfectly, as perfect as they can get it, during these sieges, so that they didn't have to face defeat. Whereas other people that might not be so insecure about whether or not they're going to win, because their castle's just a couple k's down the road, wouldn't be so inclined to put as much effort into these sorts of things.
Yeah, as you're saying with like let's say back home would be, as in Europe, a defeat of the Crusader army is the complete eradication of everyone.
Yeah.
It's not a slow route back to friendly territory. Even though they've retaken settlements, that they're still in enemy territory.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's no rule. Failure isn't an option, which is of course always kind of used, but in this case,
it pretty much isn't. Yeah.
A decisive defeat of the Crusader force would lead to anyone surviving slowly being picked off one by one.
Yeah, very much so. Continuing on this religious aspect, you can kind of if mass and such was continued to be observed, and Easter and all those important religious ceremonies, it raises another point, right, which kind of goes back to the social aspect of it. And it wasn't just a massive army. There were priests, there were clergymen in this, right? And there must have been a vast number of them, because there's only, your voice can only carry so far. You can't give mass to 30,000 people all at once. You need multiple people to carry that out at the same time. So there must have been quite a contingent of clergymen and religious people as well going along with this crusade. And it's important to remember that, because battles and armies and wars and things don't just contain soldiers. A lot of times, a lot of the army is logistics, foraging for supplies and things like that, as well as, and scouting, I guess, as well as,
They would have brought their wives and children, blacksmiths, family. There was the actual percentage of soldiers would have probably never been more than 10%. There would have been just a huge horde of hangers-ons. Interestingly enough, there was probably a whole army of prostitutes, ironically.
For the Holy Crusade.
Why not? But yeah, just the last sort of thing to touch on is sort of how Europe looks at this crusade after the crusade, like several centuries after. And this kind of takes us back to the first sort of chronicle I spoke about, the Chronicle of the Hungarians, because in it, it's written in around the 1380s, so quite a long time after the crusade, and it talks about one of the kings of Hungary being Saint Laszlo. And what's really interesting is that Saint Laszlo, there's a story written in it that essentially the kings of France and England and Burgundy and all these other places, the vast majority of the important kingdoms in Europe sent messages to Laszlo to say, yo, this crusade's going to happen. We want you to be the king, right? And we want you to lead this crusade, right? And the thing is that the whole story is made up. It never happened. And we know it never happened because St. Laszlo died before Pope Urban II even called the crusade in the first place. So we know that's not possible. But the fact that this 14th century writer felt obliged to write that story in is quite it's quite telling, because here's someone who was canonized as a saint, and yet he didn't partake in the crusades. So it's the kind of thing where how can we call him a saint if he didn't participate in the most successful and important event of modern Christian history. And he goes so far to essentially demonize his successor, a guy called King Komnene, who came after. And he's portrayed as a really terrible person that's also hunchback and dyslexic and mentally disabled and all the rest of it, because he needs to be the worst possible person you can think of, because Komnene doesn't participate in the Crusades at all. And he actually, like I said, the king of Hungary at the time the Crusaders were passing through Hungary actually fought the Crusaders, which happened to be him. And so we can see that the Crusades are seen later on in medieval society as being this super important thing, right? It really was the greatest achievement of modern Christianity. And so to be against that in some way, even though Komnene was rightfully defending his country against Crusaders who were, besieging his cities and, destroying his lands, he's the worst possible person on the planet, and you can't get worse than him.
That was the First Crusade. Can't wait for the next one. Bet it's going to be equally as bloody,
exciting and
equally bloody, murderous, and religiously fanatic.
Except, conversely, an epic failure compared to an epic
spoilers.
success. But yeah.
Well, see you all next time.
Thanks for listening.